First of all, thank you for doing this.
My pleasure.
Really appreciate it. So tell me when you first became aware of Sir William Osler.
I first became aware of Sir William Osler when I was probably in college. My father used to talk about Osler, and he used to quote Osler's aphorisms to me. And so I knew of Osler, but it wasn't until I started medical school that I really got interested. And about halfway through my first year of medical school, I went to the library and I got a copy of Cushing's biography of Osler. And that's when I really got to know Osler.
Was he a physician as well? Or?
My dad was a doctor, and he did internal medicine and then later on gravitated into emergency medicine.
When you were at Johns Hopkins, when you were there, did you know a lot about Osler's time there, or how big a footprint was there when you attended?
So when I was in medical school, as I mentioned, I first read Osler's biography, got interested in that, got more interested in the history of medicine, and began reading about the history of medicine. And the early history of medicine for the 20th century was really what happened at Hopkins, because a lot of what happened in this country was spawned by the faculty at Johns Hopkins. So I was reading all of that, and then I did my internship and my residency at Johns Hopkins. So I had the opportunity to sit on the 8th floor in a little carrel of the library and read lots of history of medicine. And that's how I got into all of that. And of course, the Osler residency program at Johns Hopkins is named for the founder. So it's steeped in tradition.
Why do you think it's important for medical students and young physicians to know about Osler?
Nowadays, medicine has become extremely technical and the science predominates. And that was different than in Osler's day. In Osler's day, the transition was being made from something that was very clinical to something that was more scientific. But Osler was really interested in the patients and in humanities and understanding people, which is something he did better than probably anyone else. I think as medicine becomes more technical, it's increasingly important for young doctors not to forget that the whole focus of this is to help the patient. So Osler brings that all back.
So many things that he's contributed to medicine and the scientific community. What do you consider Osler's biggest contribution?
Well, I know Osler thought that his biggest contribution was bringing students onto the wards and the clinical teaching that he did. I think that certainly has been a lasting legacy, because our model today is very similar to what Osler espoused. But nowadays, we're even bringing students into the hospital sooner in their first and second years. So I think that was a big innovation. But the other thing I think is his lasting interest in the humanities. And that's something that I think we need to push more, because it's getting lost a little bit.
How do you think we keep the humanity in there, especially with our medical training and education?
Oliver Wendell Holmes said that half of everything that we knew at the time, and this is the 19th century, was probably wrong, especially when it came to medications. And if we took all these things out to sea and sunk them in a chest, we'd probably be better off. That's still probably true today. A lot of the things that we think we know are going to turn out not to be so. So we can't get too wedded to the science today, but people don't change. People have the same problems, the same fears, the same anxieties today that they had 150 years ago. So I think it's really important for young physicians to focus more on the patient. The technology is going to continue to evolve. Medicine is a process of lifelong learning, but understanding people is critical, and we can't lose that in the technology.
How has Osler inspired you personally or professionally, or both?
Well, Osler was very interested in the history of medicine and in book collecting. And so one of the things Osler said is that everyone needs to have a hobby, and my hobby became collecting medical books. So I have been doing that since I started. My very first book was a copy of Ralph Major's Classic Descriptions of Disease that my father gave me. And he gave me that book because he wanted me to see what the doctors in the old days were able to do with just their senses, and how they could take a history and examine the patient and really get most of the essentials. So that was the first book. My second book was Cushing's The Life of Sir William Osler. I bought a first edition of that from a little bookshop up in New Hampshire. And I've just been collecting ever since. So I collect Osler, I collect anatomy, I collect Hopkins and things related to Johns Hopkins. And way leads on to way when you start collecting.
Roughly, how many books are in your collection, would you say?
Well, I collect both books and off-prints. So off-prints are journal articles that were reproduced and doctors would give them away to people. I have right now about 11,400 items in my collection.
Wow, that's fantastic. When you first were exposed to Osler and some of his aphorisms, do you have any favorite aphorisms that stick out to you, that resonate most?
I think my favorite saying that Osler had was that it was more important to know what kind of patient had the disease than the particular disease the patient had. And I think that's still true today, especially with chronic diseases, because the management of chronic diseases is really about the management of the patient.
When you think of Osler, you think about equanimity. Why is that so important for physicians and really anyone today?
I think the whole concept of equanimity has in the past been misunderstood. People thought that Osler meant that we should be cold and uncaring, and that's far from it. What Osler really wanted people to do when dealing with clinical situations is to not let their emotions get carried away with them. If you really are going to do the best for the patient, you have to be able to control your emotions. You want to give the patient hope. You don't want to create undue anxiety or leave them with despair, but you really need to be able to control your emotions when you're dealing with people, because in many cases you're dealing with life and death situations and they're very frightened.
When did you become aware of the American Osler Society?
Oh, I think I was aware of the American Osler Society when I was at Hopkins. Victor McCusick was in the Osler Society and I knew him. He was my chief of medicine. Mac Harvey, who had been one of the early members, maybe even one of that first cadre of members, was also there, and I knew him. So I had heard about the Osler Society.
Why do you think the society is so important, and what do you get the most out of being a member?
As Osler recedes into the recesses of time, it's really important that someone keep his memory at the forefront. In the early part of the 20th century, everyone read his textbook. Nobody's reading his textbook anymore. It's become history. But I think that the ideals and the concepts that he espoused are really important for the day-to-day practice of clinical medicine. So the Osler Society helps to keep that alive through our meetings, through our publications. The other thing we do is we stimulate people to study the history of medicine, which is also something that's kind of died out in recent decades.
And I remember on one of our Zoom calls when we were talking about, how to keep membership flowing and everything, you had a great line. I don't know if you remember it, but what would you say to either a young physician or a medical student in terms of, if they were on the fence about, I've heard about this society, should I join or not?
Well, I'll tell you a story. I thought about joining for a long time. And here in Pasadena, we had the George Dock Society. We'd meet twice a year for dinner. Someone would give a talk. And I would always run into John Carson, who was a member of the society. In order to become a member of the society, you had to present a paper. So I would talk to John about it, and he would say, when are you going to join? When are you going to join? And I'd say, I'm very busy. I have to write the paper, and I just don't have time. And he looked at me and he said, we're all busy. Write the paper. It was one of the best pieces of advice that I've ever gotten. I have so enjoyed being a member of the Osler Society. I so enjoy the fellowship with the other members, going to the meetings, hearing the talks, but more importantly, the hallway conversations. If you're thinking about it, take the leap. So what did I say that so impressed you?
Well, that was part of it. I remember you telling that story. The other thing that you said was something to the effect of, it's hands down the best organization that nobody's ever heard of.
Oh, I'm sure that's true.
When we were talking about ways to, what can we do to bring in more young people and just to keep it flourishing. And that just really stuck with me. And that was like, yeah, that's absolutely right. It's like once people are exposed to it, and once people especially come to a meeting and experience everything you talked about, they're bought in fully.
Yeah.
But it's how do we let people know it exists and that it's something that can enhance their lives, not only their medical lives, but I think just in terms of their experiences.
Well, how long have you been a member?
Well, I've been a member really since after I made the film, which was 2005, 2004, 5, something like that. So I've been a member for a while, and to be honest with you, I didn't think I was worthy of being a member. But I had done the film, and some people started talking and saying, listen, we would really like you to be a part of this and to help with, the other things. And I had that interest really from my dad.
Right.
And growing up and seeing how invested he was with the society. So even though I'm not a physician, it's been really meaningful to me, and a lot of, like you said, the friendships and everything that's come out of it. But just in terms of I learned so much from everybody, and
Right.
I've learned so much from Osler and one of the reasons I wanted to do the original film is I think there's a lot, of course it's geared, for the medical profession, but I think there's a lot of universal aspects that anyone can apply and can use.
And you're a perfect example. You don't have to be a doctor to be a member of the Osler Society.
Yeah.
A good friend of mine by the name of Peter Kaufman runs a company that supplies airplane parts.
Okay.
And he's very interested in history, and he's written a book about business, but he also is very interested in Osler. Mm-hmm. And so what he did is he got the rights to the persisting Osler. He has had thousands of copies made, which he gives away free to medical students.
Oh, wow.
Because he believes that, the things that Osler said, the things that he taught are universal. It's not just about medicine. A lot of it is about professionalism. How do you treat your fellow man? That sort of thing. Yeah. So I think there's something of Osler for everyone.
What it meant to you to find out that that your peers wanted you to become president of the society.
It's a very great honor, to be elected to be president of the American Osler Society. So I was very happy that they did that. I'm very proud of that. And I love the Osler Society. So to join the ranks of people who've been president of the Osler Society is just a great honor.
Your presidency was historic from the sense that your term, occurred during a global pandemic. So can you speak a little bit to what that was like?
Yeah, so it was a very unusual year. We went into the year thinking that we were going to hold the meeting in Pasadena. The American Osler Society had last held the meeting in 1990. And at that time, Earl Nation sort of led the charge. He was living here in Pasadena. Of course, I was not a member at the time. But so 30 years passed. We thought it would be time to come back to Pasadena. And the Huntington Library has a great collection of medical books through the Los Angeles County Medical Association, which had deposited their books there. And also George Dock's books were there. So great collection on the history of medicine, very pertinent to what we do.
Sure.
We had everything lined up. We had the Westin Hotel in Pasadena. We were arranging for buses to transport people from the hotel to the Huntington Library. And then the pandemic began to emerge. And we really didn't know what was going to happen. So I think it was in the early part of the year, probably January, February, we were still thinking, could we hold the meeting? It was scheduled to come at the end of April. And finally, it began to become more and more apparent that we weren't going to be able to travel. We weren't going to be able to meet in person. And we didn't yet have the technology that we have now with things like Zoom to be able to do it remotely. We have since learned a lot. But at that time, we decided that we were just going to have to cancel the meeting. One of the things that was difficult about that was that we had put a deposit down and we had to cancel the meeting, and this was unprecedented. So we didn't know what to do. There was language in the contract that if, force majeure, if there was some catastrophe of nature or something, that we could get out of the contract, but we didn't know. We didn't know if that would apply. So we went to the management at the Westin and we said, look, nobody can travel. We can't have the meeting here. And they said, well, we'll give you your deposit back. So that worked out well.
How was that experience for you? Going just in terms of, everybody has their own experience. It was tough on everybody, but was that?
I think it was sort of a tumultuous experience. We were learning every day. We didn't know what we were going to do. We didn't know if we could have the meeting. We didn't know if we could somehow do the meeting remotely. We really didn't understand Zoom at the time. We were just starting to learn about that. And so ultimately we decided just to cancel the meeting. The following year we had the same problem.
Right.
But we knew more about the technology and we were able to hold the meeting remotely via Zoom. And I think it worked pretty well. Had we known about the technology, had Zoom really been, I think, up and running well at the beginning of the pandemic, we might have had the 2020 meeting by Zoom. But as it was, we did the prudent thing, which was to stay home. We really didn't know what the pandemic meant or what it was going to be like or how it was going to unfold. So at that point, I think the best thing and the decision we did make was just to stay home.
And the other thing is, unfortunately, you couldn't give your presidential address. So what's going on with that? Is that something that we might be able to get?
The problem with doing the presidential address is that every president wants to give an address. And so it's very difficult to have two presidential addresses in the same meeting. I think what I'll do is probably write the address and then maybe we'll publish it in the Oslerian. And that way I'm not going to steal anyone else's thunder, but I still get to have my address published.
With COVID being, obviously a global medical crisis, just curious what your thoughts are of the way, it was handled, at least here in this country.
Well, I think from a medical standpoint, I think we did the best that we could. I think that the medical system was overwhelmed. We were lacking supplies. We didn't know how to handle this virus. We didn't know what it meant. We didn't know the optimal treatment. And so we were learning every day. I think the things that made it more difficult was the overlying politics. It became a political football. It shouldn't have been.
Right.
But unfortunately, that's what happened. And so that, I think, created a lot of confusion. People didn't know. People thought that other people had different agendas. And so it was a very difficult, tumultuous time. I think we could have done better. Interestingly enough, I think that one of the best sources of information was Johns Hopkins, Osler's institution that he helped to found. They did a very good job of bringing credible information for everyone to share.
What do you think Osler's response to COVID would have been?
Well, I think if you look back at what Osler did, he was very interested in tuberculosis, which was a respiratory disease, highly contagious, for which there was no treatment. He was very interested in typhoid fever. Again, there was no vaccine at the time, highly contagious disease, it was seasonal, had a public health component. So those are diseases that he really focused on. And I think he would have done something similar had he been alive. He would have made a study of the pandemic. At the same time, I think he was very interested in public health. And if you go back to his early days at McGill, when he was a young professor, one of the first things he was asked to do was to staff the smallpox ward because he'd had smallpox and was immune. So I think he would have been at the forefront of pushing vaccination because he knew how valuable that was. And in fact, he and Henry Barton Jacobs were very interested in vaccination. And Jacobs had a huge collection, which is now at Johns Hopkins, on the whole subject of vaccination.
I'm just curious what your thoughts are in terms of how we can do better at healthcare delivery and access to healthcare.
Well, there are several problems we're going to have to deal with. The biggest problem that we face in the United States is the high cost of healthcare. If you look at all the other Western nations around the world, even the closest to us, we are still twice as expensive. We spend twice as much per capita on healthcare as other nations. So that's one of the issues we've got to address. We've got to find a way to make healthcare more affordable. And you have to remember that the government pays a considerable part of healthcare through Medicare, Medicaid, the VA, Marketplace. So the government has a big investment in this. If healthcare costs less, it would be more accessible, and we could use the money for other things. So I think that, education suffers because so much money goes into healthcare. So the biggest issue we have is how do we control healthcare costs? Yeah. Beyond that, I think the next thing is, how do we deal with the maldistribution? Because 80% of the people live in urban areas, but we still have to care for people in suburban or in rural areas. Sure. And that's a big problem. How do you get doctors into rural areas? One of the things the pandemic taught us is that we can do a lot remotely. And I think that, and Congress has acknowledged that because they're going to extend some of the things that happened during the pandemic to make remote access easier. But I think that's going to be an important feature in the future, that a lot more care is going to be done remotely.
This is a huge question, but why do you think we don't have like universal health care here in the States?
Yeah, I think there are a number of reasons we don't have universal health care. Our healthcare system grew out of the Second World War. During the war, wages were frozen. And so the only way to attract someone, you couldn't pay them more, but you could offer them benefits. And the big benefit that started to be offered was health insurance. And so over the years, people have been offered health insurance as a benefit. It becomes very valuable. It's also tax deductible to corporations, but not to individuals. So it's a huge tax benefit to businesses. It's in a sense, kind of almost a free benefit that they can provide. Nevertheless, they struggle with that too because the healthcare costs have gone up. So I'm not sure that our present system is sustainable. The other thing is healthcare consumes almost 1 out of every $5 of GDP. Anything that is that big is hard to change. There's a tremendous inertia. People want to maintain the status quo. Whether you're a hospital, a doctor, a pharmaceutical firm, even the patients are reluctant to change because we know what we have. We don't know what the future might bring if we went to some sort of universal health care. I think we'll eventually get there because that's where the rest of the world is, and I don't think we can continue to afford the health care that we have, especially given the outcomes that we get. I mean, we are not getting outcomes that are twice as good as anyone else.
Kind of related to that, what challenges for medical students are they facing, in terms of, I forget exactly what the figures are, but it was some pretty enormous average in terms of the amount of student debt that they get at the end of medical school. What's the best way to keep the applicants kind of flowing with medical school?
When you look at some of the members of the Osler Society, they will tell you that medical education was pretty affordable. I mean, Charlie's told me that it was pretty affordable back in his day when he went to Hopkins. Even in my day, it wasn't terribly expensive, but the cost of medical education has far outstripped inflation. And young people today are coming out with debt that is the equivalent of a home mortgage. So you're coming right out of school, you're young, you want to start a family, and you've got this huge burden. And I think right now, it channels people into certain specialties because they pay more than others, which is a shame. But I think it will also have the future effect of steering people away from medicine. Now, we're starting to see schools build up endowments. A number of schools have gotten large gifts, and they're doing things to make medical school more affordable. NYU, for example, students can go to school and there's no tuition. Hopkins is working on the same thing. I think a lot of the medical schools will get there. We have to find ways to make health education more affordable. We just can't go on like this, or we're going to lose the best and the brightest who will go off into other fields.
You mentioned Charlie Bryan, who just came out pretty recently with the Osler Encyclopedia. I know you also were very supportive of that as well. What your thoughts are and why you think that's such an important work for people to have?
Well, the Osler Encyclopedia touches on lots of people and subjects that were important to Osler. If you go through the index of the Cushing biography, essentially what Charlie did is he took many of those topic headings and expanded them into papers. And he called on the members of the Osler Society to help him write it. And so he had lots and lots of contributors who wrote a chapter or two. I participated in that as well. But it's a very handy reference book, and it gives you kind of a synopsis of what was happening in medicine from about 1880 to about 1920. So it's really a great reference book.
Speaking of books, you also had a more recent publication. Can you talk a little bit about the Persisting Osler 5, which you...
Oh, okay. Yeah, the Persisting Osler. Initially, when the society was formed, there was a debate as to whether or not to have something like a transactions, where they would publish the papers presented at the meeting. And Charles Rowland was involved at the time, and he was an editor for the Journal of the American Medical Association. And the point he made was that if you want to make Osler widely known and accessible to other people, you can't hide your papers in the transactions. You need to publish them broadly in journals all over, in different fields, different specialties. And so that was the impetus for the wide distribution that we have of papers. But it was also felt that it would be a good idea to take some of the best papers every 10 years and bring them together into one volume. So every 10 years, there's been a persisting Osler. And this last one that we did was the first one that was done without Jerry Berendis, because he had been one of the editors of the first 4. So I think Charlie and I and your father, Marvin Stone, were the editors. And I think it was a nice volume. And I'm looking forward to the next one in 10 years.
Yeah, and how was the process? I know it was a lot of work. I heard from my dad, but what was the process like for you?
Well, I hadn't done anything like that before, so this was new to me. Fortunately, Charlie is an excellent editor. And I'll tell you, Jerry Berendis was an excellent editor because I was in the Persisting Osler 4, and he was one of the editors. And I got lots of comments back, and I had to draft and redraft until I got it just right. So I learned from that process. I think that having Charlie, having been through the previous editions, was knowledgeable and knew what to do. That really helped a lot. And we got all these papers in that people sent to us, and we reviewed them. We had a committee. We read them all, and we critiqued them. And I think it turned out pretty well.
For you personally, what's been the best part of being a part of the American Osler Society over the years?
The best thing about being a member of the American Osler Society for me has been the people that I've met and the friendships I've developed. That really is the best thing. People who share my values and my ideals, people that I've learned from. I learn something from every meeting that I go to, and it's great to renew friendships. So that's been the most valuable thing.